Hi, welcome back to Metapunk Zero. I'm Andre, and in this episode, I'm going to be talking about the transition from talking about my psychosis experience into speaking about more metapunk topics, metapunk proper. And that is metapunk as a speculative fiction genre and as a philosophical movement or attitude. I'm not sure what to call it exactly, but let's go with that for now. Please stay tuned. Hi, thanks and welcome back. So, what am I going to talk about in this transition? I want to get away from speaking directly about my psychosis experience. I think I've more or less covered most of the ground on that. I will be bringing it up from time to time, and it's obviously it really had a massive impact on my thinking. But I want to talk about these things, my sort of philosophical ideas and more in more detail, so that people kind of know what I'm talking about and kind of my approach to things. And I think that has to start with a definition of faith, because my psychosis experience really was very much a crisis of faith. And I'll speak more about that in a minute. Um, but first, I want to ask, what do we mean by faith when we speak about faith? And the working definition that most people go with is that faith is something like belief without evidence, and that's almost exactly the definition that atheists tend to give faith. And that's also the definition that religious people tend to give faith. I mean, they agree on something, which is pretty phenomenal. But I think they're both wrong, and I'm one of these annoying people that sits at that crossroads of sort of philosophical or scientific thinking and spiritual thinking, because I really feel this spiritual dimension of life, and so I'm one of these spiritual but religious, or spiritual but not religious kinds of people, and I have to ask questions like this: what do we mean by faith, and do we really mean that it means belief without evidence? And I don't think it does, because the idea of faith being interchangeable with belief, just saying, well, I believe in God, or I believe in the Bible, or whatever. I believe in this holy book, this holy scripture, this religion, or whatever it is that we believe, just because that's what I believe. That doesn't really address the question, of what faith really is. And I think we have a clue in the word itself. Faith comes from the word fide, or fides, which is a Latin word for trust. And I think that's really what the meaning of faith really is. And that's a big difference, because the idea of belief, that's like knowledge without a reason for the knowledge. That's in philosophical terminology, that's epistemology. That's making a claim about what we can possibly know. But I don't think that's really what faith means. And if you go back, I think this is supported, by the vast majority of theology. Serious theology. I don't mean just believing in something. I think people who've been thoughtful about their belief and about understanding what belief really means, and what faith really means, who've really asked these questions. And if you go back to the definition of trust, that's an emotional attitude. It's not an epistemological attitude. It's this idea that when we trust, we place our trust in something beyond ourselves. That's a much different sort of attitude. That doesn't imply any particular knowledge. That doesn't mean that you hold ideas that you can't support rationally. It means that you just embody this attitude of emotionally opening up to the world and to your experience in a particular way. Um, it comes with a feeling of safety, I think, on some level, or a feeling of aspiring to a feeling of safety in the absence of safety. In that sense, it can kind of foster courage. That faith and courage can be kind of interchangeable, and maybe that's more in line with what faith really means. Rather than this idea of knowledge without evidence or belief without evidence. And so, like Einstein famously asked this. He said the most important question you can ask is whether or not you believe you're in a benevolent universe or a hostile or indifferent one. And I think that's key. I think that really addresses this question, because that's what faith is. Faith is trusting that the universe has your back and knowing that you're going to be all right in the long run, at least, because in the short term things can be very dark. And so that's kind of where I'm going with this. And I think it's really important to make that distinction, because when I talk about my psychosis experience, I talk about I mean, it was an entirely a collapse of meaning and faith in my life. I really stopped trusting the universe. I was worrying so much about my problems. I had all these financial concerns. Aside from abuse, financial worry was my biggest, the biggest cause of my psychosis. A real lack of money, and like, so I've talked about basic income and how basic income would have saved me from going through a psychosis, and it would have saved taxpayers, a great amount of money in hospital bills and emergency calls and all kinds of things. They would have saved money by having a basic income, at least in my case, and all those sorts of things. And I've talked about that. But when you don't know that your needs are going to be met, it's very hard to trust your circumstances. It's very hard to trust the universe, And there's so many examples of that. I hear so many examples of like from within the Christian canon. I don't know if you're into the law of attraction stuff at all. I mean, I sort of follow that, although I'm critical of it. I'll speak about that in another video, but I've followed that a bit. And some of the speakers, the new thought speakers, who kind of came up with the law of attraction stuff, or really kind of popularized it in the early 20th century. They talked a lot about Bible references, and I've been doing some reading on some of that, and they talk about that. They talk about faith. They talk about digging the ditches, because the rains will come. Digging and making sure that there's ditches to catch the rain to irrigate the fields, and doing that ahead of time, taking action on faith that something positive will come to pass. And I think that's something that's very difficult to do in our society. I think there's so many economic reasons. I think there's many reasons of politics and just social differences and social norms and all those sorts of things that can really get in the way. And there's personal trauma that can get in the way. I spoke of safety. And feeling really unsafe in the world is what happens when you experience trauma, whether that's at the hands of abusive people, or abusive circumstances, or just uncertain times, or whether that's some acute tragedy that strikes, like some natural disaster, or whatever, your house burns down, or you get into a car accident. I mean, those can also create trauma. And trauma really is really marked by this sense of feeling unsafe in the world, and really not being able to relax at any time, because you're always sort of expecting this kind of these traumatic events and circumstances and actions by other people. You're expecting them all the time, and so you're kind of always on edge, and you can't get into a positive state. And that's really kind of the opposite of faith in a lot of ways, right? So can we see faith as an antidote to trauma? I don't know. I mean, that might be going a little too far, but I think there's things that we need to do in our body. There's things that we need to learn about our own physiology and how to regulate our emotional reactions, like to physiologically and somatically, that I think go into that. But I think part of that can be holding an attitude of trust with the universe and trying to cultivate that, alongside all these other measures that we can take to be more settled in our body, and to offset the trauma and to heal and overcome the trauma, so to speak. Not that I don't know, I wonder about that. Like, I know I'm just sort of rambling off topic here, but I wonder if trauma is ever really healed, or if we integrate the trauma and the trauma becomes something that we can derive fuel from, on some level. I think that's possible, but I think that's kind of what we mean by healing. It's not like the scars ever disappear, but we do get stronger, if we allow it, if we really connect with ourselves and are able to connect. And I think that's kind of also implied by this idea of faith, this sense of connecting to something deep within you, but also something in the wider world, something beyond all the immediate circumstances. And that means connecting to something unseen, something invisible, something that we have no rational sense to believe in. But again, it's not necessarily about knowing that it's there. It's about just trusting that things are going to work out in the long run. You know, the psychosis experience was a real collapse of meaning for me. I had this sense that everything that I've been working for all of my life, which was very much to overcome my trauma and to make something out of it, to make something useful out of all the terrible things that I'd experienced, and all these things that had caused me so much pain, trying to find ways to save other people, to spare them of going through those things, as much as I could, or to at least let people know that they're not alone in their difficulties, and I'd worked really, really hard for that. I was working on Metapunk. I was working on my writing. I was working on games because I love games. Not so much. I mean, but even in a sense, for use as a healing modality. Like I think we can gamify certain things, and we can use games in very constructive ways. They don't just have to be for entertainment, but very much as we use stories to gain perspective, and to gain a perspective that we didn't have before, and to have an understanding of life that might be a little new to us, to share wisdom in storytelling. And that's something that humanity has done since the beginning of humanity, and I think that I had worked so hard for that, and yet I couldn't solve my basic survival challenges, that it felt like all of my dreams were going to go nowhere. I didn't really want to be around anymore. I really was having trouble justifying my own existence to myself, and I really felt disconnected. I really felt disconnected from my source and from myself, and then all hell broke loose, quite literally. I encountered the Christian devil, and I encountered the classical underworld, and I encountered, much weirder things. I encountered alien, I don't know, invasion or life or whatever. I don't know what it was. These were all sorts of delusionary kinds of experiences that I was going through, and symbolically they all have meaning, and I'm still unpacking that, and I probably will for the rest of my life, try to understand this. But the point is that everything that I believed in had fallen apart, and even my trust in the universe, even my sense of faith, in it. I might be going through something hard now, but at least I have a purpose. At least I can make something of myself, and make something of my difficulties, and at least I still feel connected to spirit. I still feel that the world has meaning, and all those sorts of things. Those were all things that I believed right up until just before the psychosis, or like, as I went into the prodromal stage, as you start to succumb to psychosis, that started to fall away, and all I was left with was just anger, just absolute rage at how unfair my life had been, and how difficult things had been. And then these voices, which I hesitate to call spirit in an uplifting way. They were negative, whatever they were. I don't know if they have an existence independent of my own mind. I don't know. I'm not sure the distinction matters at this point. The effect they had on me was very real. All it takes is a few words, really, to upset us and unbalance us if we're in a bad place, and to really get at our triggers. And that was certainly what was going on. And so all of these things kept telling me, the message that I was getting from the voices and from everything else, from the circumstances and the hallucinations and everything else, was that my life was now meaningless, that I was going to suffer without end for no good reason, except that the universe could torture me just because it enjoyed it, or because it could, something like that, or some part of the universe. I fought really hard to kind of believe, to really hold on to the idea that there was something bigger than all of this darkness that I was facing, something bigger and brighter, and that would carry me through. And I really had to remember the light in the dark. I had to hold on to that, and I kind of did. It really retreated. I got to a particular place, got really dark, and then I just kind of got to a place where I wasn't in any immediate physical danger. And even though things were very strange, and I was in the hospital, and I thought, and this is the weird part, like it felt like these circumstances were changing me. Like I wasn't even gonna be able to hold on to myself. My whole life had fallen apart, and now my personality was being changed and altered by the hospital, by the drugs they put me on, and they really do affect you that way. But so it's really iffy. The premise that hospitals are good places for people in mental illness is really questionable when the experience of being in a hospital is quite intimidating and threatening when you're in a difficult psychosis experience, when you have any anxiety at all about any of it. And when these things actually do have a real effect on your personality, it's really hard. But somehow I managed to hold on to the idea that I had a core within me. I had something that made me me. And that even flies in the face of some of what I was taught in Buddhism and things like that. Although I think even Buddhism embraces this on some level, in a roundabout way, even though we talk about the idea of being free of the ego and, that sort of thing, surrendering the ego. I mean, that's very much what the representation of like Jesus on the cross is. His heart is wide open, right? Like his arms are out, his heart is exposed to the world, and he's surrendering his ego to what may, and trusting. And that like there's no bigger act of faith than that, just opening yourself up to whatever becomes of you, and trusting that you'll be carried through, but you can't just, this is the tricky part, because through my psychosis experience, I learned that I couldn't just surrender to what was happening. I couldn't. What I had to surrender to was something within me, not my circumstances. I didn't want to just roll over and die. I didn't want to roll over while the devil or while these hostile forces, just tore my life apart and tore my being apart. That's not the kind of surrender that's meant by that, but it's like embracing the idea that you're going to be all right, and that's something deeper, it's something I'm trying to gesture, but it's like something deep in your heart, that kind of, and so that's what I did. I just started breathing through my heart, and that's how I cultivated faith, that's how I got through the last hospital experience, without going back into psychosis. That's what allows me to take the medicine that they give me and believe that no matter what it does, and no matter what their intentions are, and no matter how much it might be about controlling my symptoms, that in the long run I'm not going to lose myself to it. It's what allows me to continue getting up every morning, and I don't know. I've really had to fight for it, but I got to tell you, it's something that did not come with any knowledge. It came quite the opposite. There was lots of knowledge. There was lots of rational, from my perspective, even though other people would have thought I was delusional and hallucinating and psychotic and all those things. From my perspective, there was a coherent narrative, and that was my knowledge. That was my knowledge of the world, and I was in a very hostile universe, to recall Einstein's question, But something in here was like, okay, but even if you're in a hostile universe, you still know what benevolence is. You still understand benevolence. You still understand compassion. You still understand wisdom. You still understand all the values that you held before this disaster took hold. And so I held on to those. I held on to my values, you know, which are compassion and wisdom and love, you know, and free expression and like something like exuberance, you know, inspiration, spirit, spiritus, you know, like the breath, the divine breath. And so I breathed, you know, I breathed through my heart, and that got me through. And so I don't know if this has been very useful. I know I've kind of rambled all over the place, but this is kind of what got me through it. And as I start to rebuild my sense of my world and even my ability to speak, I've been struggling to speak this whole time. I haven't made one of these videos in a while. I apologize for that. It's been a little rough lately, but as I rebuild my life and I rebuild my sense of the world, I'm also going to sort of reattempt what I've been trying to do with this channel for a long time and with my writing and everything else. I'm going to try to get back into it and try to build Metapunk into what it should be, what it should have been long ago, you know. Trying to put the consistent effort in to make something tangible that people can understand and go from there, you know, share it with the world. And mostly, as I've said, it's a reiteration of lots of older and wiser philosophies from all over the world, you know. But it's, call it a curation of what I find meaningful in all those things. And not just what I find meaningful in those philosophies, but what I find in those philosophies that gives meaning to everything else. You know, I have a book on my shelf behind me called Religion and Nothingness by Keiji Nishitani. And it's a really complicated book. It was given to me by my first philosophy teacher. He didn't give it to me. He gave me the suggestion. I bought it myself. But, you know, I mean, he might have given me that. He gave me lots of other books. He was a very kind man. But he reminded me, Keiji Nishitani is a really complicated book, but something that he says in the very first chapter, and this, I thought this was always a perfect rebuttal to the atheist, sort of the non-spiritual atheist, you know, and it doesn't necessarily work for religious people either, but he says you can't ask what the point of religion is because religion is what allows you to find the point of everything else, you know. And I think by religion in that sense he means the spiritual calling. He means this heart-centered thing, which isn't about, I mean, it can include scriptures, it can include religion, it can include mythological and storytelling traditions, it can include practices that you can use like prayer and meditation and dance and, you know, music and all these things that you can use to uplift yourself and to connect, you know, with the world around you and with the divine, you know, with God, with whatever. But it's more basic than that, you know. It doesn't have to be about all that stuff. It doesn't have to be about the trappings of religion or the culture of religion. It can just be just as simple as this, coming from here, coming from the heart, connecting with your heart, connecting with the hearts of other people, you know, going beyond knowledge, within and beneath knowledge, but also beyond it, you know, getting out of the mental frame of the ego mind and getting something into this heart-centered, body-centered, kinship-centered way of being in the world, you know. And so that's really what Metapunk is about. It's a spiritual calling, and I want to try to honor it as much as I can, even though I felt during the psychosis like I hadn't, and like I'd failed it, and like I was doomed for it, you know, because we need it, because we need things like that, because when we are doomed, we have to find out what really matters, what's left, you know, when all the ills of the world, speaking of the classical underworld, when all the ills of the world are released by Pandora's box, what's left? You know, where's the hope? Where's the hope that's left in the box? What's left when everything leaves you? You know? And that is the divine within you, you know? So we all really kind of have to find that for ourselves. All these philosophies and religions and all these wisdom traditions, they're just pointers that point us to those things. And I see Metapunk as just, again, as a curation of some of that, of the breadth of what I've been able to pick up from here and there, and so I want to share it. But I really had to fight for it. I really had to fight for it. And so anyway, I'm just rambling now, but I hope this has been useful. And if not, I hope you'll come back for the next one. Maybe it'll be a little more useful and a little less rambly, and we can go from there. So thank you for joining me. Take care.